edge of the Moors Desert in northern China. The desert lies near the irrigated lands of the Hetao section of the Yellow River.
In the heart of northern China lies a silent enemy, a sea of sand that once swallowed everything in its path. For decades, these deserts crept closer to cities, burying roads, farmlands, and even entire villages. Every gust of wind carried a warning that nature was winning the war. But then, something extraordinary happened. China decided to fight back. What began as a small environmental effort quickly turned into one of the most ambitious earth engineering projects ever attempted: the removal and transformation of billions of tons of sand across some of the harshest terrain on the planet. And just 1 year later, the world stood stunned. Where endless dunes once stretched to the horizon, now stood green forests, solar cities, and thriving farmland. This is the unbelievable story of how China reversed the desert, defied nature, and built hope where there was none. Welcome to the extreme discovery. And this is how China removed billions of tons of sand from the desert and amazed the entire world.
The desert problem. When you think of deserts, you probably imagine endless sand dunes under a blazing sun, harsh, lifeless, and far away from human civilization. But for China, the desert isn't some distant landscape, it's an ever-expanding threat, creeping closer to homes, cities, and farmland every single year. Across northern China stretches a series of colossal deserts: the Gobi, the Taklamakan, and the Kubuki, together covering over 2.6 million square kilometers. These are among the largest deserts on Earth, and for decades, they have been growing at an alarming rate, swallowing villages, cutting off roads, and burying everything in their path. It wasn't always this way. Many of these regions were once semi-arid grasslands, home to herders, farmers, and wildlife, but decades of overgrazing, deforestation, and unsustainable farming turned the soil weak and dry. The strong winds blowing down from the Mongolian plateau did the rest. As the topsoil eroded, the sand began to move, slowly at first, then relentlessly. By the 1990s, satellite images showed a terrifying trend. The deserts were expanding by thousands of square kilometers every year. Powerful sandstorms, born in the Gobi, would sweep across northern China, turning skies orange and air toxic. Cities like Beijing and Lanzhou often found themselves buried under thick clouds of dust that blocked sunlight for days. Residents had to wear masks long before anyone had ever heard of a global pandemic. For them, sandstorms were a yearly nightmare, reducing visibility to almost zero and covering everything with a thick layer of dust. By the early 2000s, scientists warned that if this trend continued, vast portions of northern China could become completely uninhabitable within decades. Rivers were drying up, farmland was turning barren, and millions of people were being forced to abandon their homes as the land beneath them quite literally turned to sand. What had started as an environmental issue was rapidly becoming a humanitarian crisis. More than 400 million people were living under the shadow of desertification, a number larger than the entire population of the United States. The situation was especially critical in regions like Inner Mongolia and Ningxia, where villages disappeared overnight. Entire communities had to be relocated because their water sources had vanished. Farming, which had sustained generations, even the government's attempts to build infrastructure, were being undermined. Highways would vanish under waves of drifting sand, and railways would clog up within hours of a sandstorm. For a country with a population of over 1 billion people, dependent on agriculture for food security, this wasn't just an ecological challenge, it was a national emergency. China had to find a way to stop the deserts from spreading, or the cost would be catastrophic. Food production would collapse, millions would lose their livelihoods, and large-scale migration could destabilize entire provinces. But there was a deeper layer to the problem. Unlike most countries, China's desert regions sit in some of the most complex and difficult terrains on the planet. The combination of extreme heat, freezing winters, scarce rainfall, and shifting sands made any restoration effort seem impossible. Traditional farming techniques couldn't survive here. Even planting trees, a simple idea on paper, was a monumental challenge in an area where roots couldn't reach water and winds could tear out saplings overnight. Yet, despite the scale of destruction, China refused to give up. Instead, scientists, engineers, and environmentalists began to ask a bold question. What if they could fight back? What if deserts could be stopped or even reversed? To do that, they needed to first understand the desert itself. For years, teams of researchers studied how dunes formed, how sand moved, and what conditions allowed vegetation to survive. The findings were remarkable. It turned out that the desert wasn't a lifeless wasteland. It was an ecosystem waiting to be balanced. If they could anchor the sand, slow down the wind, and introduce the right kind of plant life, the land could heal itself. But to make it happen, China would need to move mountains, quite literally. The battle against the desert would require removing billions of tons of sand, building massive irrigation systems, and creating artificial oases in places where rain might not fall for months. And so began one of the most ambitious environmental projects in human history, a plan to reshape nature itself and transform a sea of sand into a living landscape. It started with a single question: could humans out-engineer the desert? The world doubted it. But, as China was about to prove, when faced with impossible odds, they don't back down, they build.
The Kabuki miracle, turning sand into green. In the heart of northern China lies one of the most incredible environmental success stories the world has ever seen: the transformation of the Kabuki Desert. For decades, this massive stretch of golden dunes was a symbol of despair and destruction. Covering an area of more than 18,000 square kilometers, the Kabuki was once considered one of the deadliest and most uninhabitable places on Earth. Nothing grew there. Water was nearly impossible to find, and sandstorms rolled across the region like ocean waves, swallowing roads, homes, and farmlands. But today, the Kabuki tells a completely different story, one of human ingenuity, persistence, and the power of green technology. What was once a wasteland has become a living, breathing ecosystem filled with grasslands, forests, and thriving communities. It's now known around the world as the Kabuki miracle. To understand the scale of this achievement, you first have to understand just how hopeless things once were. The Kabuki Desert sits inside Inner Mongolia, surrounded by mountains and plateaus that trap dry, hot winds. Rainfall is less than 200 millimeters per year. In the 1980s, overgrazing, deforestation, and poor farming practices caused the land to lose its moisture and nutrients. The result was devastating. The once fertile soil turned into loose sand, and strong winds began to carry that sand southward. Villages were buried overnight, roads disappeared. Even the mighty Yellow River, one of China's lifelines, began to choke with sediment washed down from the desert. For local farmers and herders, it seemed like nature had turned against them. Many were forced to leave their homes in search of better land. But in the late 1980s, China decided to confront this environmental disaster head-on. And surprisingly, it wasn't just the government leading the charge. The transformation of the Kabuki began as a partnership between scientists, private companies, local farmers, and the Chinese government. The key player behind this miracle was the Elion Resources Group, a private enterprise that took on the near-impossible mission of turning the desert green again. Their approach wasn't about fighting nature, it was about working with it. The first step was to stop the movement of the sand. Engineers began by building sand barriers, simple but effective fences made from straw and brush that trapped sand and reduced wind erosion. These barriers slowed down the shifting dunes, creating stable patches of land where plants could begin to grow. Next came the plants themselves, but not just any plants. Scientists selected hardy species that could survive in the extreme environment: saxaul trees, licorice plants, and desert willows. These plants have deep roots that hold the soil together and draw moisture from underground, allowing them to thrive even in near-drought conditions. But planting in the desert wasn't easy. Water was scarce, and irrigation systems were impossible to build using traditional methods. So engineers turned to innovation. They developed solar-powered irrigation systems that used energy from the desert's endless sunlight to pump water directly to plant roots through drip lines. This not only conserved water, but also made it possible to grow vegetation in areas where rainfall was practically zero. As the years passed, small patches of green began to appear across the Kabuki Desert. Villages that had been abandoned started to see life return. The local people were encouraged to participate, planting trees, maintaining irrigation systems, and harvesting valuable plants like licorice, which could be sold for medicine and cosmetics. Suddenly, the desert wasn't just an environmental problem, it was becoming an economic opportunity. By the mid-2000s, the results were undeniable. Over 6,000 square kilometers of desert land had been restored. Satellite images showed vast stretches of green cutting through what was once endless gold. The temperature in the region dropped, rainfall increased, and sandstorms became far less frequent. What was once a lifeless desert had transformed into a sustainable ecosystem that could support people, animals, and agriculture. But perhaps the most inspiring part of the Kabuki miracle is the way it changed lives. Local herders and farmers who once lived in poverty found new sources of income through ecotourism, green farming, and solar energy projects. The desert that once pushed people away was now pulling them back. In 2017, the United Nations officially recognized the Kabuki Desert Project as a global model for desert restoration.
calling it the only successful example of desertification control achieved on a large scale anywhere in the world. Experts from Africa and the Middle East have since visited Kabuki to learn how China achieved the impossible. And yet, despite its global fame, the message from Kabuki is simple. The fight against desertification is not about technology alone. It's about perseverance, cooperation, and vision. It's about believing that even the most hopeless land can breathe again if humanity works together. The Kabuki miracle didn't happen overnight. It took decades of hard work, innovation, and courage. But it proves something extraordinary, that deserts don't have to be symbols of death and despair. With enough determination, they can become symbols of life, hope, and rebirth.
Removing billions of tons of sand, how it's done. The idea of removing billions of tons of sand from a desert might sound impossible. After all, deserts are defined by sand, endless shifting seas of it. But that's exactly what China set out to do in Kabuki, and the results have stunned the world. The process was not as simple as just digging it up. This was a feat of precision engineering, environmental science, and massive scale coordination unlike anything humanity had ever attempted before. When the project began, the Kabuki Desert was constantly on the move. Every gust of wind sent tons of sand drifting into nearby villages, highways, and even rivers. The first challenge wasn't to remove the sand, but to stop it from moving. Engineers had to stabilize it before they could transform it. To do that, they used a method known as sand fixation. At first glance, it seems simple. Keep the sand from flying away. But the science behind it is astonishing. Workers and machines laid out millions of straw checkerboards, grid-like patterns made from local grass and wheat stalks. Each square was about 1 meter wide, creating a natural barrier against the wind. These grids slowed down the gusts that whipped across the dunes, allowing moisture to stay in the ground and giving seedlings a chance to survive. Next came the biological approach, turning sterile sand into living soil. Scientists discovered that planting traditional crops was pointless in the desert. They would die in days. So instead, they chose plants that could grow in pure sand. Species like Salix mongolica, sea buckthorn, and licorice roots were perfect candidates. Their deep roots could anchor the dunes and pull up trace amounts of underground moisture. Once planted, these hardy species began to form a web of life under the surface, holding the sand in place naturally. But this was just the beginning. While plants stabilized one part of the desert, heavy machinery went to work on another. China deployed a massive fleet of excavators, bulldozers, and sand transport vehicles, many of them equipped with autonomous navigation systems guided by AI. These machines didn't work randomly. They followed computer-generated maps created using satellite imagery and drone surveys that tracked the movement of the sand in real time. Engineers could literally see the desert shifting on their screens. Using AI models, they could predict where the dunes would move next and send machines to redirect them before they buried infrastructure or fertile land. It was like watching a game of chess between humans and nature, except this time, the humans were winning. In the most critical areas, the sand wasn't just moved, it was reused. Instead of treating sand as waste, China treated it as a resource. Massive sand processing plants were built near the Kabuki Desert to convert desert sand into usable material for construction, glass manufacturing, and even solar farm foundations. The idea was simple but brilliant. The same sand that once destroyed farmland could now build homes, cities, and renewable energy plants. But moving billions of tons of sand requires energy, a lot of it. To make the project sustainable, China turned to one of its greatest strengths: green technology. Huge solar farms were installed at the edges of the desert to power the machinery and water pumps. These solar panels didn't just provide clean energy, they also shaded the ground and helping nearby plants grow. Some experts call this the world's first symbiotic desert project, where energy and ecology help each other thrive. Meanwhile, engineers tackled another massive challenge: water. To keep plants alive and sand stable, they needed an irrigation system that could reach across thousands of square kilometers. But in a region where every drop of water counts, waste was not an option. So, they built AI-controlled drip irrigation systems that delivered precise amounts of water directly to plant roots. Sensors in the soil detected temperature and moisture levels, automatically adjusting water flow to maintain ideal growing conditions. With this combination of technology, planning, and environmental science, China began to remove and reshape billions of tons of sand, not by brute force, but by balance. Areas that were once lifeless dunes are now green corridors capable of producing vegetation, absorbing carbon, and even supporting livestock. But perhaps the most impressive part of this achievement is the speed. In less than a decade,
China managed to reclaim thousands of square kilometers of desert land, a process that would have taken other nations half a century. The Kubuki Desert, once seen as a lost cause, became the testing ground for future environmental recovery projects. Satellite data from NASA and the United Nations now show a visible transformation. What was once endless gold is now streaked with patches of deep green, living proof that human innovation can reverse even the harshest damage caused by nature and time. And yet this is just the beginning. China's success in removing and reusing desert sand has inspired similar projects in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. The Kubuki method, combining robotics, renewable energy, and eco-science, could one day be the blueprint for saving other deserts from consuming the world's arable land. In the end, removing billions of tons of sand wasn't just about clearing the desert, it was about rewriting what's possible, proving that with enough technology, determination, and vision, even the most lifeless places on Earth can be reborn.
The role of technology. Behind China's desert miracle lies one unstoppable force: technology. Without it, removing billions of tons of sand and bringing life back to the barren wasteland would have been impossible. From the sky to the soil, every part of the transformation was powered by innovation. High above the Kubuki Desert, drones became the eyes and hands of this massive project. Equipped with high-resolution cameras and AI-driven mapping systems, these drones scan the terrain from every angle, creating ultra-detailed 3D maps of shifting dunes and erosion patterns. This data was then analyzed to pinpoint where the sand moved most, where new plants could survive, and where human access was impossible. But these weren't just surveillance drones, they were planters. Once the maps were ready, the same drones carried capsules filled with nutrient-rich soil and seeds, gathering them precisely where growth was most likely to succeed. What once required hundreds of workers on foot could now be done in hours across thousands of acres. From above, satellite monitoring systems provided the bigger picture. China's space-based sensors tracked the green coverage of the desert month by month, analyzing how quickly vegetation spread and how the temperature of the soil changed. The data flowed directly into central AI systems that automatically adjusted irrigation schedules and planting density in real time. On the ground, engineers used eco-engineering membranes and biodegradable nets, thin, flexible layers that stabilize sand while allowing air and water to pass through. These nets acted like an invisible hand, holding the desert in place long enough for roots to take hold. Over time, the material naturally decomposed, leaving behind only living soil and strong vegetation. Then came the concept of smart deserts. China's vision was not just to reclaim the desert, but to make it intelligent. Entire areas were equipped with solar panels, water sensors, and automated irrigation systems controlled by AI. When humidity dropped or temperatures rose too high, the system adjusted automatically, using solar power to pump underground water and regulate conditions. A self-sustaining ecosystem, half machine, half nature, that thrives where no life could survive before. The economic transformation. But the Kubuki story is not just about saving the environment, it's also about creating opportunity. What was once considered lifeless, useless land is now at the center of a massive economic transformation. The green desert quickly became a gold mine, not of minerals, but of sustainable industries. The vast open spaces that once reflected only sunlight now host solar farms and wind turbines stretching to the horizon. These renewable energy hubs generate clean electricity for millions of homes and power the very systems that keep the desert alive. At the same time, ecotourism has taken off. Visitors from across China and the world come to see what many call the miracle of Kubuki, to walk through places that were once buried in sand but are now covered in green. Hotels, research centers, and scenic viewpoints have created thousands of jobs for local residents. But perhaps the most astonishing change is in agriculture. With the sand stabilized and soil restored, farmers are now growing medicinal herbs, fruits, and drought-resistant crops where nothing could grow before. These products, from sea buckthorn berries to desert honey, are being exported around the world. In just a few years, Kubuki went from being a symbol of scarcity to a model of wealth, generating billions of dollars annually in eco-friendly industries. The desert that once consumed villages is now feeding families, creating jobs, and inspiring countries facing similar challenges. The global impact. The impact of China's desert control effort has rippled far beyond its borders. Environmental scientists around the world have been shocked by the speed of transformation. Some regions saw green coverage increase by over 400% in a single year. Satellite images show a clear line between the past and the present. Where yellow dunes once dominated, vast patches of green now stretch across the horizon. Because of this success, China is now exporting its desert control technology to other nations battling the same problem. In Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, Chinese teams are working with local governments to replicate the Kubuki model, combining robotics, AI, and solar power to turn deserts into productive land. The United Nations has praised China's project as one of the most successful examples of sustainable land management in modern history. It contributes directly to the UN's mission to combat climate change, reverse desertification, and restore ecosystems. In short, it's proof that restoring the Earth's balance isn't just a dream, it's something that can be engineered. What the future holds. But China isn't stopping here. The next goal is nothing short of revolutionary: to reverse half of its total desert area by 2035. That means turning millions of additional acres of lifeless land into fertile ground. Plans are already underway to build a massive green wall, a connected network of reforested zones stretching across China's deserts. When complete, it will create one of the largest living barriers on Earth, stopping desert expansion and stabilizing ecosystems for generations to come. And beyond China, this technology may redefine global environmental strategy. If deserts around the world, from the Sahara to the Gobi, can be stabilized and reclaimed, humanity might finally be able to reverse centuries of damage to our planet. What began as an experiment in Kabuki has now become a symbol of hope for the world. China didn't just remove sand, it reimagined what's possible. Through innovation, determination, and the courage to dream big, a once barren desert has become a living, breathing ecosystem, a place where technology and nature work hand in hand. In just a few decades, China has proven something extraordinary: that no land is beyond saving, no challenge too vast, and no desert too empty to bloom again. This is not just China's story, it's the blueprint for humanity's future.